They told me time heals. They said knives of memory would dull, that the ache would become a dull, manageable throb. They lied. My name is Katherine. I learned the hard way that time does not heal, it sharpens. It files edges, reveals seams, and forces you to decide what to do with the raw, hot metal of betrayal when it flashes in your hand. For a long while after I found out, I thought I would break. Instead, I became something I had never planned to be. Patient, precise, and terrifyingly ordinary. Daniel Reed was not a man I hated. That made it worse. I'd loved him with the kind of clean, obedient devotion you see in movies where the woman forgives too quickly and believes in redemption. Daniel had a laugh that stilled the chaos inside me. He knew how to order coffee exactly the way I liked it without asking. On Sunday mornings, when the sunlight would happen to be perfect, he'd make eggs and pretend he disliked jazz while humming Coltrane under his breath. He was gentle in ways that mattered, except for the way he loved lying. I found the first message by accident. A wrong tab, a forgotten email open on his laptop while he showered. Maya Collins. The name landed in my chest like a fist. The email was clinical, businesslike. I stared at the cursor blinking between lines of text, each one an elegant betrayal. Invitations, references, travel plans. Nothing explicit, nothing theatrical. That was the cruelty of it. The affair had been sibilant and slow, like mold. Little disappearances, explanations that fit too neatly, nights claimed by work. I watched the map of his life redraw itself without me. People give you advice in this state. Friends insisted on closure, on conversation, on the kinds of melodramatic confrontations that make for good Netflix episodes. My sister told me to scream, to make him taste the timbre of my fury. Elena, who'd been my anchor since college, suggested legalities and locks and moving out. They meant well. They were wrong. You don't want closure when you've been betrayed. Closure is a lie sold as mercy. What you want is an answer to the question that eats through you at night. Why me? Why us? And when there is no satisfying answer, only a cascade of small decisive choices made by another person, the only honest response is to take back control. So I did what he hadn't expected. I stepped into a role Daniel could never have imagined. The architect of his ruin, framed in a way that would allow me to win without looking like the monstrous woman in a tabloid spread. It began with patience. I stopped crying in the bathroom. I made myself small and invisible, and then, when no one was watching, I practiced the kind of calm that fools even the people closest to you. Atmosphere is everything. I kept our home exactly the way it had always been. The plant by the window, the unremarkable mug with its chipped rim. To the outside world, I was the woman who forgave, who believed in second chances. Inside I catalogued. Daniel worked in urban development. A public face, glossy presentations, press conferences where he smiled into the camera like a man who had built his life from clean lines and careful angles. Maya worked in a boutique PR firm that had a specialization in brand revitalizations, for companies that wanted to seem younger, cleaner, sexier. It was the kind of detail that could be useful. Names became nodes. Dates became coordinates. I listened when he texted. I archived receipts. I followed patterns like a cartographer mapping the slow erosion of a shoreline. I did not confront him. I absorbed. I learned his habits, the restaurants he favored for his lunches with Maya, the code names they used in messages, the nights he said he had meetings and arrived home smelling like someone else's perfume. I learned the rhythm of his calendar. Thursdays were for site visits, Fridays were late-night strategy sessions. I learned that he believed he was smarter than me. Arrogance opens doors. The first stage was exposure. Not explosive, not humiliating in the crude sense, but surgical. I began with small, precise leaks. A forwarded email here, a misdirected calendar invite there. I was careful to make everything plausible, to build a pattern that would look, from the outside, like incompetence rather than malice. Daniel's confidence was the perfect veneer to crack. He started missing small deadlines because he was distracted. His colleagues noticed. A client was irritated. A rumor, organic and unforced, bloomed. In the office, the undercurrent intensified. Daniel's boss, a woman named Katherine Holt, ironically sharing my first name, though she was all stern suits and rehearsed smiles, began to call him into her office more often. Their relationship had always been professional. Now it was strained. People notice when a team lead sleeps at the office, when presentations start to wobble. I watched him tighten like a wire. No one suspected me. Women who are too nice are seldom considered the dangerous ones. They are harmless, comfortable. While I undermined him internally, I created a parallel reality outside. The persona of a woman who had been betrayed and chosen dignity. I became the picture of elegance at brunches and grabbed coffee with the same friends who knew him. I let the rumor mill take the small pieces I'd left behind and weave them into a narrative that tarnished him in the court of social currency. Unreliable, distracted, careless with commitments. It was petty, perhaps. It was also effective. But social ruin is a slow burn, and Daniel's ego still had momentum. He was clever in ways that mattered. If I wanted total victory, I would need more than gossip and missed meetings. I would need evidence that nobody could dismiss as coincidence. I needed leverage, something that would prompt a board meeting, an investigation, something irreversible. That leverage came disguised as betrayal turned into a weapon. One evening, while he was out on another strategy session, I sat at his kitchen table with the laptop he never logged out of. I found one of those messages that made your skin crawl not because of the words but because of how ordinary they were. Calendar invites for a retreat, expense reports with hotel names, a line item for an event coordinator that matched Maya's firm's recent invoices. Names connected. Dates aligned. I printed quietly, each sheet a small, damning mosaic. But printed documents are not decisive in isolation. Context matters. So I cross-referenced. Daniel had approved permits for a riverfront redevelopment project, one that had already become politically sensitive because of its displacement implications and the environmental assessments that hinted at deferred maintenance in the original plans. The project was ideal for headline fodder. It had stakeholders, public interest, and enough complexity that a single scandal could topple a man climbing on the backs of a fragile coalition. I took those prints and I made them sing. The real stroke was psychological. I used his own arrogance against him. Daniel loved to be perceived as indispensable. He loved control. I fed him back his grandiosity in a way that pushed him to his own undoing. On a Thursday night, I sent an email, from an address I had created that looked like a junior member of his company's ethics committee, requesting an urgent review of project approvals and potential conflicts of interest with outside vendors. The email was formal, polished, and perfectly timed. It played on his fear of being caught without preparation. The following morning, the office was electric. Daniel's boss called him in. Documents were pulled. Phones were checked. The notion that he had permitted an external firm, a firm that suspiciously matched Maya's company's billing, to influence project decisions began to circulate. I watched the room thin around him like water draining from a sink. Panic is an ugly, transparent thing. Daniel's hands shook when he took the call from the head of the council overseeing the project. He tried to charm his way out, to lace his voice with the smooth, practiced cadences of someone used to persuasion. But the council wanted explanations and documents, and explanations need evidence. My printed mosaic fit neatly into the narrative the council wanted to hear. Conflict of interest. Improper approvals. Favoritism. The language was antiseptic. Its consequences were not. I could have stopped there. At that point, many people might have felt satisfied. They might have thought the humiliation of being accused was punishment enough. But revenge, when it becomes architecture, seeks permanence. I wanted a result that could not be brushed away, a reckoning that would be recognized in headlines and in the bitter silence of ruined professional relationships. So I escalated. I leaked details of the correspondence to a local investigative reporter I found through a friend of a friend. A woman named Lila who had an appetite for stories that exposed the rot in polite institutions. Lila asked questions with the soft ferocity of someone who lives on coffee and contempt for polished facades. She didn't need coercion. She needed fragments. I gave them willingly, allowing her to assemble the truth in the public square. In the early morning, an article landed online. Developer under scrutiny. Ties between project and private PR firm raise questions. The headline was a blade. Daniel called me that day. He tried to act surprised, to sound wounded by the apparent betrayal of forces beyond his control. I listened. I let him flail. He named Maya in that conversation with the casual cruelty of a man who assumes the woman he hurt will plead or storm or be the one to make a scene. He did not expect a measured voice that did not tremble. He did not expect what came next. I know, I said. I could hear the grain of panic in his throat. I have everything. His laugh that followed was brittle. You think blackmailing me is going to solve anything? You'll ruin us both, Katherine. I felt the heat rise and then recede, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. I'm not blackmailing you, I answered. I'm protecting what's mine. And I meant it. The phrase had a legal ring that mattered. Protection, not extortion. I had not asked for money or a public apology. I wanted him gone. I wanted his hands off the life we'd built together. I wanted to take the dignity of his career and make it mine to distribute as evidence. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded. Daniel's email trail was subpoenaed. His phone records were audited. Maya's firm found itself entangled in questions about procurement and the ethics of promotional contracts. The company board began to whisper about his fitness to lead. Friends stopped answering his calls. People he had charmed for years began to ask difficult questions. The world he had sculpted with smiling presentations began to feel like a stage collapsing into itself. Yet the sweetest moment was not his professional unraveling. It was the human fissure that followed, the shame evident in his eyes when he realized that, for once, charm could not appease the hunger of consequence. He tried to bargain, to appeal, to make deals. But when your integrity is punctured by the evidence of your choices, bargaining becomes a clumsy, desperate act. There were nights when I stood at the window and watched him sitting at the kitchen table, the light from his laptop painting his face in sickly blues. He would sip the same tea he always drank and stare at the screen like a man trying to find the shape of an escape route in the grain of wood. I had a blurred mix of emotions in those moments. Pity, glory, something like vindication. It was not purely joy. Joy would have been grotesque. Revenge was its own solemn thing. People asked me later whether I had enjoyed seeing him humiliated. The truth was a complicated thing. There are pleasures in justice, in seeing someone reap the harvest of their seeds, but there is also a stark loneliness to winning by dismantling what you once loved. Daniel's face, when he was forced to step down from the project and submit to public inquiries, looked like a man who had been hollowed out. That hollowing included me. But it also included space where I could rebuild. My victory had a public apex. The council released its findings 6 weeks after the initial article. Irregularities in vendor selection, insufficient documentation, a failure to disclose potential conflicts of interest. Daniel resigned under pressure. Maya's firm lost the account. Several board members were called to testify. The headlines were careful and clinical, but they were there. My name was not in them. That was deliberate. I had wanted him to be undone by the machinery of justice and consequence, not by spectacle. He would lose more than a job. He would lose the platform built on the pretense of ethical stewardship. But even with his career collapsing, Daniel still courted pity. He showed up at my door once, the rain making him look younger in the wrong way. He said he was sorry. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He pleaded for forgiveness like a man asking a bank for a loan. I opened the door because I wanted to see his face close up, to feel the visceral reality of his repentance. He smelled of wet pavement and the expensive cologne he saved for weekends. His eyes were red. He was contrite, or at least he was contrite in his own way, the way of someone who cannot imagine the depth of the harm they've caused. I thought we could try to work through this, he said, voice cracking. I can explain. We can go to counseling. I don't want to lose you. I held the wound he expected to see, the soft place where he thought I would collapse into warmth. Instead, I offered him something colder, steadier. You lost me when you decided we could be a secret and a convenience, I said. You lost me when you thought what you had with her was separate from what we had. I can't be anyone's afterthought. He reached for me as if to touch my face, to anchor himself in a gesture that had once been enough to steady my world. I stepped back. It was the smallest movement, but it was final. Don't come back, I told him. This life is mine. He left. He went to his sister's apartment, then to a friend's house. His name lasted in the news for a shy season, then faded to footnotes. The company performed damage control, hired a new CEO with a spotless resume and a practiced smile. People returned to their routines. I moved on as people do, awkwardly without much grace. I took a job in a small gallery, restoring paintings for collectors who wanted their memories polished. The work calmed me. It was delicate and honest. I liked seeing broken things made whole again, though I knew the irony that I had not sought to make Daniel whole. Revenge, when it's crafted with care, needs a coda, a private reckoning that proves to you, and only you, that the effort was necessary. Mine came in a small, almost banal way. A year after the scandal, at an exhibition opening in a space full of people whose names I did not know, I saw Daniel across the room. He had been cleaned up in a way that made him unrecognizable to anyone who had not known him when he was whole. He smiled at me with an automatic civility that suggested he believed everything had been forgiven, that time had lapped at the stone of his life and smoothed it. I walked toward him, my steps measured. The gallery was full of murmurs and wine and someone discussing modernist form with a voice that sounded rehearsed. Daniel's smile widened instinctively as he thought he had done enough penance. We spoke for a few minutes, the kind of polite small talk people use to make their lives seem uninterrupted by chaos. He asked about my work. I told him I restored paintings now, that I liked the way old varnish softened after careful solvents, revealing truth under grime. His eyes tracked around my face, searching for the old woman he had known and thinking he'd maybe find a fracture he could slip into and fix. When he left, he gave me a last glance, one that tried to remember what had been. I felt a bubble of something rise, not triumph precisely, but closure of a clean, clinical sort. It was not the vindictive glee some might have expected. It was simply the knowledge that he had been dismantled by the consequences of his choices, not by a melodramatic exposure I had orchestrated for theater. He suffered the subtle indignities that come with professional ruin, the small humiliations of people who had once praised him and now whispered. He would have to live with that and so would I, but I would live with it on my terms. There are things I will not forgive myself for. There were nights early on, when I thought about confronting him publicly, about burning everything down in a blaze of righteous fury. I did not. I am not proud of the small manipulative games I played. They were a form of violence, too, a quiet, meticulous one that left scars. I am aware of the moral landscape here, that I traded one kind of cruelty for another. But the scales were not even. He had chosen duplicity. He had chosen to keep a life that included me and also excluded me, to press on with secrets that would have become the bones of a future he had no right to build. Healing came in odd ways. I learned to love my mornings again. The way light falls across the studio table, the sound of a brush across linen. I learned to be alone in a room without feeling like I was being eroded by potential losses. I dated with the careful curiosity of someone testing waters that I no longer feared. I watched men for the propensities they displayed rather than the promises they made. Sometimes I think about Daniel in the way one thinks about seasons past. Not with rancor but with a long, steady understanding of cause and effect. He was a man who thought he could have two lives and that no one would notice. Some people manage such duplicities for years. Others are found out by chance. He was uncovered by design. He lost because he had built his life on cheated foundations. I won because I chose not to break in the place where he had expected I would. I used his arrogance against him, and I used the apparatus of the world, institutions, inquiries, social scrutiny, to make the consequences real. Victory, for me, wasn't about seeing him broken on the floor. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my life. It was about choosing a path where I would not be collateral to someone else's comfort. It was about recognizing that love, when wielded as a weapon of convenience, is not love at all. If there's a moral here, it's not pretty. Sometimes you have to become a person you hadn't planned to become in order to survive. Sometimes that person is cold and deliberate and frightening in the same breath. I did not seek to revel in his downfall. I sought to reconstruct myself from the wreckage he left behind. In that reconstruction, I found a steadiness I had not known. I found a version of me that could look at a broken painting and imagine the patience required to bring it back to light. People ask, quietly, if I was happy after it was over. Happiness is a blunt word. There are days of uncomplicated light and a pleasure so pure I almost stumble. The smile of a stranger when I fix the white of their favorite painting, the unexpected laugh over coffee with a man who is learning to be honest in small, staggering ways. There are also times in the late hour, when memory is a raw thing and I breathe through it. But mostly there is a constant, firm knowledge that I chose my life back. Katherine Reed no longer exists because I tore that part of myself away. Not as punishment, but as liberation. I am Katherine, with the same bones but a new interior. I am patient. I am careful. I am, perhaps, dangerous in a way that is not cruel but resolute. If Daniel ever reads this, he might think I am boasting. He might think this is triumphalism. He would be wrong. This is not a victory lap. This is a ledger entry in a life that had to be recalculated. Revenge did not make me whole, but it made the world right enough to start rebuilding. And in the places where he thought he could be safe, in his neat office and his clean suits, there will always be a shadow of consequence. Time in the end did not heal him. Time unspooled his choices into a pattern everyone could see. I am not proud of everything I did. I own the coldness as the cost of survival. If you ask me if I would do it again, if I would choose slow, deliberate ruin over the messy catharsis of a scene, I would say yes. Not because I love vengeance but because I love myself. When I close my eyes now, the image that comes is not of him on his knees begging. It's of a painting, its varnish yellowed and blind, and the moment when the first solvent reveals color beneath. It's the small, steady work of making truth visible again. That is how I would measure victory. Slow, precise, and absolutely mine. I thought the ledger had been balanced and that my life would proceed in neat installments. Mornings of varnish and coffee, evenings of quiet. But endings are porous things. They leak. People expect tidy resolutions, and life rarely obliges. After the gallery opening, the months that followed felt like walking through a neighborhood after a storm. Some houses repaired, some gone entirely, the ground still soft where roots had been pulled. I kept working, restoring canvases with the same patience I had applied to dismantling Daniel's life. Solvents smelled of citrus and ether. They were honest in a way I had come to crave. When pigment revealed itself beneath decades of neglect, I felt the same rush I had felt the first time I made Daniel's missteps visible. A slow, near imperceptible triumph. Truth, I learned, is tactile. It has a texture you can strip and examine. But truth has consequences, and consequences have a way of kicking up dust you thought settled. One afternoon, about 9 months after the scandal, I opened the mail to find an envelope without a return address. Inside, a photograph. It was cheap, glossy, the kind you print at a corner shop. It showed Daniel standing beside a stretch of riverbank, the very stretch his project would have reshaped. He looked small in the photo, a brief silhouette against concrete and sky, as if the image had been taken from a distance and then cropped with cruel intent. On the back, in neat block letters, someone had written, "You started something. Not finished." For a moment, a terrible, exquisite moment, I felt the old heat of panic. Old habits spring like ghosts. I imagined the worst, a public smear, a threat, someone trying to undo the painstaking architecture of ruin I'd erected. Then the panic gave way to a steadier feeling I had felt so often since: strategy. The world had taught me that fear can be mapped and, with patience, controlled. I called Elena first. She told me not to go to the police unless I felt directly threatened, that the law often took sides with people who could make good press releases. She suggested I get cameras for the shop, to change locks, to be visible in ways that deterred the anonymous. Practical, vanilla precautions. I did them. I installed a simple camera above the rear door, an extra deadbolt, and gave Lila, the reporter who had burned a bright, useful trail through Daniel's public life, a heads up. Lila had become an odd ally. She sent a terse text back: "If this is him, he'll overreach." Her appetite for drama was a kind of ballast. She wanted to know whether the story had another chapter. I kept the photograph on my work table for 2 days. I didn't show it to anyone else at first. I let it sit near a half-restored still life, where the blue in a peeled apple matched the blue of the river in the picture. When I did let it breathe, after 2 nights of circling the edges of it like a cautious animal, I took it to Lila. She held the photograph like someone assessing a new instrument, tapping its corners, squinting for anomalies. "Look at the light," she said finally. "Taken around sunset. Someone close to the riverbank. That angle. It's not a passerby. It's deliberate. Do you think it's Daniel?" I asked. She shrugged. "I think it's someone who wants you to feel watched. Whether it's him or someone he hired, I can't say. But there are always layers in these things." Layers. I had built so many of them. I had thought I knew the thickness of every stratum. Daniel had been the only variable I had planned for. I had not counted on the possibility that he or someone for him would find the appetite for retaliation. That naive calculation, thinking the professional ruin would suffice, was an indulgence of my earlier, softer self. 2 weeks later there was an email in my gallery account. No subject. No signature. The body contained a single line: "You took everything. Now live with the consequence." And then the threat turned concrete. The county inspector called my gallery to ask whether I had any documentation connecting my restoration work to a local foundation that had funded part of Daniel's redevelopment project. My name was in the complaint. Someone had filed a Freedom of Information request with my studio's permit. My landlord received a call from an anonymous number asking about my tenancy. It was small, bureaucratic harassment, the kind that wears people down, but it was efficient. Whoever was behind it understood leverage as well as I did. I am not a person who runs. I'm careful, yes, but flight does not belong to my repertoire. I tightened boundaries. I stopped posting about my work on social media. I kept paid security at the gallery during openings. I made friends with a locksmith named Tomasz who always smelled faintly of machine oil and coffee. He laughed when I asked for stronger locks without judgment. In the quiet of evenings, I thought of escalation and of the cost. Not just to me but to those around me. Revenge can become an engine that chews the hands that feed it. But then something else happened that made the calculus more complicated. Maya called. The first call came as a surprise. Elena had let it ring twice on my phone and then handed it to me with a little smirk, as if to see whether I would accept. I did. I recognized Maya's voice before she said her name, a thin quality of nerve stitched under cultivated poise. She sounded smaller than she had in the photographs that had circulated, as if the scandal had forced her into a lower register. "Katherine," she said. I didn't know how else to reach you. For a second, I toyed with the idea of being cruel. I had ideas that would have been satisfying, witty jabs that would have ended the call in public ruin. Then her voice slotted into my memory in a way that made me curious rather than vengeful. There is a difference between punishing those who hurt you and being curious about what created them. "You work with Daniel?" I asked evenly. "I did," she replied. It was complicated. Isn't everything nowadays?" She laughed brittly. "You're right. Look, I'm not calling to ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. I called because someone is harassing me too. And because I think we might be the only two women left who can identify the next move." It struck me then that there was an honestness in her fear. It was hard to tell whether she was an accomplice turned target or a target turned contrite. Either way, we had common ground. Someone or some group was trying to unsettle the perimeters of both our lives. That kind of asymmetry fascinates me. It implies a deeper network, a set of actors who believed they could manipulate outcomes by pulling strings in quiet offices. We met in a coffee shop with cracked tiles and good espresso. Maya looked unchanged in the way that matters. Same haircut, same expensive jacket, but frayed in the seams. She admitted, in a voice that had the honesty of someone clearing their throat before confession, that she had been part of the project's PR machine. She had not been the architect of the procurement, she said, but she had participated. She also claimed she knew people, contractors, small-time fixers, who had been paid through a thicket of shell companies. "Daniel played everyone," she said. "He kept us compartmentalized. I thought I was doing branding. I didn't think I would be tied to conflict of interest statements." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because they think you took him down," she replied simply. "And because they think if they make you afraid, you'll apologize or step away from being visible. They don't understand how hardy you are." There was gall in that observation and a kindness that stung. Maya's presence complicated the neat geometry of my revenge. Up until then I had imagined her as an object in Daniel's life, a contraption he used. That was inadequate. She was a person tangled up in the same moral fog, with faults and maybe regrets. Including her into my frame made the picture less black and white. We formed a wary alliance. I shared what I had, the prints, the timeline, the email headers that suggested the harassment had a local origin. Maya contributed names, not heroic but useful, of intermediaries who had been convenient for skirting procurement rules. She was careful. She did not want to trust me with more than she needed to. That caution ended up being a source of strength. We worked like two women building a scaffold. One handed me a bolt, the other steadied the beam. Lila, upon hearing of the renewed threats, dug into the harassment. She found an IP address trace that pointed to a digital relay in a town 2 hours away. It was not decisive, but it was something. We began to suspect that Daniel had contacts willing to do his dirty work, not because he had the stomach to fight anymore, but because the networks of favors he once commanded had their own momentum. People had been paid and they would reciprocate in kind. The more evidence we assembled, the more dangerous it felt. Not because of legal exposure but because a network that favors anonymity often believes it can operate without scrutiny. We were poking at an insect nest. It is a cliché that poking things produces a reaction. The metaphor exists because it is often true. One night, after a long day at the gallery, I found my rear door ajar. The camera had been disabled. A shallow tampering, clumsy but effective. The lock had been probed. Whoever had come into the space had not taken anything. They had left, in the center of the restored floor, a child's wooden model boat. It was small and perfectly ordinary, with paint flaked at the edges. On its keel, someone had etched with a pocket knife the letters DR. It would have been easy to see the boat as a childish warning. I did not. I saw in it a message curated for me, a thing from the child of the man I had undone, an emblem of legacy, of projects that sleep like seeds. Whether the intrusion had been committed by a man who wanted to intimidate or by someone with a more pensive mind, the intent was clear. The world I had engaged with was not simple. Violence, in our case, would not necessarily be spectacular. It would be slow, insistent, bureaucratic, and personal. I slept badly that night, and the next morning I went to Daniel's sister's house. I told myself the visit was to see if he was safe. In truth, I wanted to observe the man who had been reduced from power. He answered the door with a kind of cautious civility. He had aged. Grief and defeat color faces in ways men rarely admit to in public. "I thought you would be in Dublin," I said, because a rumor had placed him abroad. He shrugged. "No. Can't afford to be too far. There are legal things." "Who is harassing me?" I asked without preamble. He looked at me as if trying to find a place to set his words. For a moment, I saw the old Daniel, the man who could persuade, who could find the right cadence to make enemies pause. Then he blinked, and something brittle replaced charm. "I don't know," he said. "But I should tell you, you won, Katherine. You broke something you probably shouldn't have." "You think I broke something?" I said. "Or you mean you broke something because you were exposed?" He turned away. "You're relentless." "And you," I said, "are cowardly." He flinched at the word. "Pride is a tender thing. If there's trouble, come to me," he said finally. "I can help." His offer was a test, a thin veneer of conciliatory power that wanted to worm back in. I pondered for a beat and then decided to accept, but not because I trusted him. I accepted because keeping your enemies close has tactical value. We arranged to exchange information through curated channels. He offered names of men who had once done favors for him. He named a contractor who had bid suspiciously low and then vanished. It was disquieting to take a helping hand from the man whose duplicity I destroyed, but useful. His payments now were in small, bitter confessions. The dance continued, probes and counters, warnings and leaks, evidence assembled and fed into the right investigative engines. Lila pushed a follow-on story that led an auditor to find invoices with familiar shell company signatures. The contractor Daniel had named turned out to be a cleaning company registered under a name that had been used in other schemes. People connected with the project began to get subpoenas. The network I had poked, the one that had tried to bully me, started to hum with the realization that we were not an easy mark. Then, abruptly, the pressure ebbed. It didn't end with a dramatic arrest or a televised confession. Instead, the people doing the harassment withdrew as other priorities took their place. Accusations moved through legal channels. Small-time fixers took plea deals and testified. Daniel's old colleagues began to distance themselves publicly. The harassments reduced to a trickle. The last anonymous call I received was a politely rude message. "This is getting old. Stop digging." We stopped digging in the sense that we had what we needed. The truth had been excavated enough that the network's advantage eroded. My life was no longer being punctured by anonymous tactics. The boat remained on my shelf, an odd emblem of how fragile legacies can be. Victory, again, came without a single trumpet fanfare. It arrived in small private victories, a municipal notice clearing my name in connection to the redevelopment, a quiet apology from a former neighbor who had assumed the worst, Lila's column that slowly converted curiosity into a heavier scrutiny that institutions could not ignore. My name exited the margins of the investigation, and the men who profited from quiet corruptions found themselves litigated into petty settlements. In the rubble of it all, I learned something that surprised me. Compassion for those who were not my enemy. When Maya and I met once more, after the dust had settled, she brought me a small package, a fragile ceramic cup she'd found in a market. "For your mornings," she said. No branding attached. We sipped bitter coffee and traded small stories. She told me she had moved cities, taken a quieter job, and was attempting something like restitution in private ways. I respected the humility in that. Revenge, like grief, narrows your field of vision. Compassion widens it again. I also began, slowly and imperfectly, to allow myself the possibility of love that wasn't a trap. There was a man, not spectacular, not heroic, named Adam, who wandered into the gallery one rainy afternoon to ask about a restoration of a small portrait. He was curious and careful, the kind of man who asked how varnish reacted to different solvents. We spent hours talking about craft. He had scars from a life of honest work and an almost shy willingness to learn. It was not dramatic. It was, quietly, repair. Our relationship was measured, not because I feared being hurt but because I had learned that the right footsteps have to be taken with attention. I told Adam things I hadn't told others, about the photograph, the boat, the nights of sleeplessness. He listened with a steadiness that resembled patience more than pity. There was a tenderness in that, not the blinding fireworks that movies promise, but the steady warmth of an oven warming bread. Sometimes, late at night when the studio was still and the solvent had washed the day into a clean palette, I would think about the choices I'd made. There is a ledger you keep inside your chest. Lines of credit debited and credited with every moral decision. I had written entries that I could not erase. I had become someone who knew how to dismantle, and that knowledge sat beside the knowledge of how to rebuild. They do not cancel out. They coexist. A few years later, on an autumn day the color of old postcards, I visited the riverbank where Daniel's project would have stood. The concrete there was still scarred from preliminary work, but growth had begun. Weeds and brave saplings threaded the cracks like a soft rebellion. I walked with Adam, who preferred silence to commentary. There were benches nearby. A family ate sandwiches, a child chased a pigeon. The past, I discovered, is like a tide pool. It holds fossils, yes, but also small living things. Do you think about him? Adam asked, simple and unadorned. Sometimes, I replied. I thought of Daniel's face when charm could not repair the harm he'd done. I thought of the nights I had spent strategizing and of the ones I had spent restoring. Not much. Do you regret it? I paused, because the question had the shape of an accusation but also a key. Regret means I would undo it, I said slowly. There are things I would choose differently. But would I undo the boundary I created? No. I value the life I reclaimed. That's not small. Adam squeezed my hand, and the pressure was a small, simple confirmation of presence. It was enough. It was more than I had expected after those early days of rage and calculation. And yet, the shadow of what I had done never disappeared entirely. There were now and then reminders that people have stubbornness in them. A friend who told me Daniel had remarried quietly, someone who sent me an article about municipal reform with a subtle note at the bottom, or a moonlit silhouette by the river that made me look over my shoulder. But these were fissures, not earthquakes. My life had rebalanced. In the end, my story did not end with a single act of moral heroism or an unambiguous fall from grace. It ended with the slow accumulation of evidence, the patient erasure of lies, the deliberate choice to build a life worth defending. I stayed with the brush, with the solvent, with the quiet patience of restoration. Sometimes I wondered if, in another world, I would have picked a different weapon than strategy and public consequence. Perhaps I would have walked away sooner, or screamed until my voice broke, or chosen a silence so total it became an absence. But this is the life I made by the choices I took, and I have learned to dwell in it without apology. Katherine is not simply a woman who avenged herself. She is someone who learned, painfully and carefully, that survival sometimes requires turning the tools of destruction into instruments of reclaiming. I am not innocent. I am not entirely faultless. But I am whole enough to stand by my mornings and the small things I repair. On the shelf above my work table, beside the child's wooden boat with the initials scratched into its keel, sits a restored portrait I completed the winter the harassment stopped. It hangs in a client's house now, in a hallway that gets little light. When I imagine it, I see the first sweep of solvent revealing a color that had been hidden. It is not showy. It is not meant to be. It is, however, true. If the seasons return and the river claims more land and people fall in and out of favor, so be it. I will be at my table, brushing away the grime, revealing what was always there beneath. That has become my revenge, my redemption, and my home.